The missionary district was without a full-time bishop for over 2 years. Western Colorado's Bishop Frank Turret filled in, such as here at St. Paul's for Easter in 1919. A year later, a hard-working Arthur Moulton would inherit the Utah district, and new challenges with it. The church had done well in non-Mormon mining areas in the boom towns. An old fuzzy photograph of the Easter altar in Park City, St. Luke's shows the attempts to bring flowers and life to the rough towns.
We celebrate the memorial of our redemptional Father in this sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving.
It's a legacy that one can still feel in the early morning services in the last surviving chapel built for the miners and too often for their widows. Pioneer Missionary District reports clearly detailed the emphasis on ministries to the Utes, mining and smelting towns. Bishop Moulton continued the practice and sent his Archdeacon Bulkley to the latest boom town of Thistle within months of taking over. But the frontier mining towns took their toll on the clergy, often from the east or even England. Bishop Moulton wrote the worst of all seemed to be Park City. He wrote, "I have not been able to find a competent man willing to stay any length in Park City." He continued that the town had few living attractions, and the church was especially needed. Ironically, the old St. Luke's Chapel is now closer to more good cappuccino places and other living attractions than any other Utah church. Bishop Moulton signed off that he would keep the flag flying and keep plugging away, something he would do for the next quarter century through a depression and a war, even though he knew Utah was hostile territory.
He was totally dedicated to his job, and I didn't find one hint of depression or pessimism. It just was not in his DNA.
The bishop hit the road tirelessly, traveling church to church. He also sent his clergy church to church and town to town. Priest Hoyt Enriquez kept a travel diary. He wrote about Parley's Canyon and Garfield in the same day. Holy Communion at St. Mark's Hospital, morning prayer at Roland Hall, and a trip up Immigration Canyon by foot. He admits he missed a service due to exhaustion. Often visits reflected the hard times. Father Enriquez writes that he was called to baptize a child. The child died. St. Mark's Hospital overflowed into tents with typhoid victims. A burial service book from St. Paul's reflects the sadness. Measles, scarlet fever, typhoid fever, and lead poisoning. But the clergy pressed on through storms, pausing to thaw out frozen pipes in the old churches and meeting places. Priests often hopped trains or rode the mail wagons. Americans didn't take to religious leaders riding in the luxury of a jalopy.
Should a priest own a car? And then the answer was, well, cars are going to be here to stay. It's going to make sense to have them. But how could they ever come up with the $500 a year needed?
Clergy with cars became big news. The Ogden Standard Examiner did a story about the priest at Good Shepherd's planned motor trip, detailing each leg of the big event. Father Hislop's car trips continued to be press events. Car travel didn't mean the end of adventure.
Every time Moulton went out, there was a flat tire, or the car, the bottom was falling out of the car, or the axle hit a rock or something like that. There was one case where they were out visiting, and the muffler fell off, and Archdeacon Bulkley, who traveled around the state for years in his Model T Ford, hitchhiked his way back to, I think it was Provo, had to wait overnight for the auto store to open, bought a new muffler, found a train that would take them to near where the car had broken down, hitchhiked with the muffler back, and they got it going 2 days later. This was common.
Oh, it was a typical story. Bishop Moulton was often late due to tire trouble on his car. It was a new era for Utah and the church. Modern life meant new issues. Of course, the Episcopal Church did not shy away from them in the 1920s. A heated national convention debated the morals of modern college women. The presiding bishop, Tuttle, decided that the flapper girls weren't the end of the world. But the big fight was over a convention speech calling the authors of the New Testament chumps. Newspapers had a field day watching the Episcopalians. Utah's Bishop Moulton then got the spotlight. He was worried that the modern church may change from the pomp of the Middle Ages. Another change from the national church came in 1923. The longtime presiding bishop and formerly the pioneer bishop of Utah, Daniel Tuttle, became ill and died. Bishop Moulton kept plugging along as he promised he would. He continued to think boldly and seldom let things such as having no to little money get in the way. He saw the need to expand St. Mark's Hospital and started the largest fundraising project ever in Salt Lake City history, $230,000. The sanctuary at St. Paul's of Salt Lake represents another bold statement of the Episcopal Church in the 1920s. St. Paul's had already torn down its first home in downtown and moved to the suburbs with what is now the parish hall. It had conducted services in the parish hall and now was ready to add the sanctuary. The church called for designs. Fortunately, this one lost. The vestry proceeded with a winning entry, but agonized over the $1,300 to add the stonework that the church is now known for. The church was built with great flair. A cornerstone laying ceremony was planned for weeks. The Masonic order brought pomp and circumstance to the ceremony. Bishop Moulton, who had fought to retain ceremony in the church, was also a Mason and no doubt welcomed the day with flair in 1927. What would soon become the biggest congregation in Utah was getting a grand home. While construction continued, the vestry worked hard to pay for the new church. December 20th, 1927 meeting minutes recorded a spirited debate on whether the church could support stocking the men's room with towels. Finally, the new church was done, complete with towels, although it would be the last Episcopal church built in Salt Lake City for the next 3 decades. Churches were creative in fundraising. The Cathedral Church of St. Mark had long sold advertisements in its newsletter. There were ads for good stable horses, a plea to get a modern telephone, trendy straw hats, and to fill your cup of joy, not only at church, but at the Troy Laundry. The Episcopal Ladies Guild of Eureka's now gone St. Andrews put on benefit plays and recitals. The Eureka paper said each number was of high order. The audience especially loved the Eureka Mandolin Club's number. Eureka also put on a Christmas bazaar and apparently had a little help from the paper. It practically ordered the ladies from nearby Tintic to attend. There was a dime here and 25 cents there, and a potluck dinner for the church. All to follow Bishop Moulton's pledge to keep the flag flying.
With prayer, energy, and a belief that God can work, that great things can be accomplished. And you and I have that same possibility in our lives today.
Good Shepherd's Women's Guild mustered up one of the most ambitious fundraisers of the time. The Guild assembled a cast of 350 for an extravaganza. It was billed as one of the most brilliant theatrical efforts ever staged with local talent. Yes, dancing, singing, comedy, pantomime, and dramatics. They wanted to dazzle Ogden with smile all for 50 cents at the Alhambra, and dazzle they did. And suddenly, the tough 20s would get even tougher. The Depression hit. The mining towns were especially devastated, places where the church had worked so hard to grow. By 1932, even the optimistic Moulton sounded down in the bishop's report to the national church. He wrote the mines closed. Park City is in trouble. People aren't even going to the hospital anymore, nor can they afford to board their daughters at the church school. Rowland Hall had been one of the most visible outreaches of the church. But even in the darkest days and in the center of the mining and rail town of Helper, Bishop Moulton started another massive project designed to better the life of the town. The church took over the YMCA building as a community center. Moulton saw it as a way to curb prostitution and drinking in the tough town. It was an example of his tireless work to fly the flag no matter what.
One of Moulton's big projects was the YMCA building in Helper. And he put up $10,000 of the family's money in loans.
Lay readers would take over some of the churches. Name after name of priests in the missionary district would be crossed out of the directory. Bishop Moulton would preach mornings in one town, evenings in another, and then Sundays all over the district. Father Enriquez would preach his sermon on George Washington, first in Park City, then at St. John's and Salt Lake, St. Mark's Hospital, and end up in Logan. Archdeacon Bulkley put mile after mile on his old, broken-down car. Bishop Moulton did the best he could for the clergy.
He got the dean of General Theological Seminary in New York to provide a subscription to the Atlantic Monthly to each of the 9 clergy and a small packet of current religious books.
Attendance was falling around the district, and of course, so were collections. However, St. Paul's got a famous visitor one Sunday. President-elect Franklin Roosevelt worshiped in the Salt Lake Church. Bishop Moulton wrote about it to the national church, always looking for good news. Bishop Moulton also had given the invocation for President Hoover's recent visit. He spoke wherever anyone wanted him. The clergy looked for new opportunities. St. Paul's held daytime Holy Week services for the business people at the Newhouse Hotel, asking if 25 minutes a day is too much for the Church of Christ. The CCC camps became new ministries. The clergy offered hope for those who had lost all. Father Enriquez would later recall his CCC ministry as a duty to perform, a privilege to serve, and a pleasure to have lived.
The blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, be upon you and remain with you, now and forever.
The Cathedral Church of St. Mark remained the area's oldest link to the past, having weathered the war, controversy, and the Depression. But on March 31st, 1935, shocked parishioners started Holy Week with the discovery of a nighttime fire that gutted the chancel. The beautiful windows, the organ, and the pioneer altar cloths were gone. But in this time of resiliency, the cathedral resumed services next door at the abandoned old Masonic temple. Bishop Moulton's next challenge was the war. He saw priests becoming chaplains. The war also took many from the pews. The number of soldiers from the families of St. Mark's Cathedral could have filled an average-sized church. Churches saw the need to be a source of comfort and support. Even with dwindling budgets, the parishes remembered those in battle and those who would not return. The church kept war shrines going for the community's reflection. The 1943 Every Member Canvass at St. Mark's hoped to meet an $11,280 budget. The canvass asked for 320 pledges, 40 of them for at least a dime a week, and topping out with 5 pledges at $2.40 a week. Again, the laity, and especially women's groups, tried to keep the doors open between the Depression and the war.
The vestry would meet not to pay the bills, but to put the bills in order of priority so that when they did have some money available, they could pay them.
St. John's of Salt Lake City was an example of a sad story. In 1942, St. John's had $18.37 in the bank. It reported Sunday offerings of 40 cents and a light bill of 75 cents. The congregation was down to 2 people and maybe 3 at each service. The December 27th log reported most of the church members were gone, sick, traveling, quarantined with the measles, one with whooping cough, and one attending St. Mark's. The priest offered to buy the building at $8,000. It was the end. They gave away all they could and sold the building in 1946. It's hard to believe now, but St. John's in Logan was also in financial trouble at the time. Earlier, Bishop Moulton had rented out the rectory and parish hall to a fraternity in hopes of making ends meet. Now during the war, St. John's was trying to become a rooming house. Neither attendance or the collection plate was overflowing. St. John's joined the LDS Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Lutherans to try to get people to just go to any church. The bishop promised to preach 2 Sundays a month in Logan. The church pleaded Easter was a red-letter day. Wear your Easter bonnet and come to St. John's. The dedicated lay members could not come up with the answers, but out of nowhere came the questions. The questions were from Quizmaster Dr. IQ's NBC radio show. Jimmy McLean as Dr. IQ was one of the highest paid radio stars around.
Presenting Dr. IQ. Thank you, Mr. Anthony, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
The Episcopalian happened to summer near Logan. He agreed to do his national show from Utah, and better yet, he would give the money to St. John's. It would be the biggest event in town. Dr. IQ would speak around town, drumming up sales, and St. John's would be front and center. The show worked better than expected. Not only did 800 tickets go for $1.20 apiece, but Jimmy McLean decided to become a priest in the Episcopal Church. Now that's a fundraiser.
The Dr. IQ program, sponsored by Vitamins Plus, will be heard next Monday night.
It had been over a quarter century since Bishop Arthur Moulton had started serving Utah. He knew the rumors. If he retired before the convention of 1946, the struggling Utah district might be combined with another Western missionary district. He continued to fly the flag, and in classic Moulton boldness, he added a mission in Bluff. The Reverend Baxter Liebler started one of Utah's most dynamic ministries, often coming to other churches for support. Little kids in northern Utah were mesmerized by the priests to the Navajos.
I remember Father Liebler probably more than some of the other priests from the standpoint of when he would come up, because I was just fascinated as far as he wore his hair long.
Father Liebler had backers from all over the country, and within a few years he had a full medical facility and the start of decades of service. One could sense a new era. The war was finally winding down. The church would never forget those who fought and those who did not come home. Sheila Whitney still is moved by the war tribute she witnessed at St. Paul's over 60 years ago. It is the beautiful window dedicated to the soldiers of World War II.
I came to church one Sunday, and all of a sudden was this gorgeous window. It was like, because the week before, it had been plain glass, and it had a real impact on me.
Arthur Moulton had led the church and even grew it from a depression through a war. He retired.
He had the most presence, and this white hair, and this tall, thin, almost gaunt man who, when he said the blessing, my gosh, you knew you were blessed.
Perhaps one of the greatest legacies of Bishop Moulton was not just his hard work to keep the flag flying, but it was his ability to work with the LDS Church. He inherited what was referred to as the Mormon problem in a bishop's report. The national church publications were also quite clear on their stance in the 1920s. It will be especially engrossing to watch the conquest of Mormonism, however near or far that may be. It must come if we all help. Moulton saw it differently. He saw a great chance for a Pacific Synod meeting. The LDS Church gave him the tabernacle and the tabernacle choir. A member of the first presidency would participate, and all would meet for a grand dinner at the Hotel Utah. Bishop Moulton would also develop a friendship with LDS President David O. McKay. There was evidence of a coexistence throughout the district. A vernal ward even met in the St. John's Episcopal Church Community Center. It's a quiet but important part of the Moulton years. Stephen Cutter Clark became the next bishop of Utah. The now Californian had once served at St. Luke's in the wild days of Park City. He was consecrated at the cathedral in Los Angeles and then arrived in Utah to be enthroned, something Utah hadn't done in years. The clergy spared no pomp and circumstance at the service. The enthronement was long and elegant. And by the way, one of the lay readers at St. Mark's that night was Parley E. Bear, who would become Chester on Gunsmoke and Mayor Stoner on the Andy Griffith Show. The new bishop looked a lot like current President Harry Truman, and he acted like him.
Clark was sort of a Harry Truman can-do guy.
He immediately announced he would work to restore Park City's St. Luke's, which had fallen on hard times. He soon discovered why it was a problem, as he was snowed out just trying to get there, but he would try again. Bishop Clark got right to work on a growth plan. Much of it was based on a post-war Utah that was full of new people. Full of kids. Baptism showed the baby boomers were here. Bishop Clark wanted to see a new camp for the new generation. Children would no longer just be seen and not heard in post-war America.
The church, throughout its history, has always established schools and hospitals. And we in the Diocese of Utah, from the very beginning, did the same thing. Because we must remember that people are more than simply spirit. They're also embodied people. And there are people who have to make the way in this world.
Bishop Clark wanted to see churches in places such as Brigham City and Tooele. St. Barnabas of Tooele started in a house with the bishop attending.
And with all the company of heaven, who forever sing this hymn.
The church is now one of the newest facilities in the diocese and one of the most modern.
Proclaim the joyful message that our God is coming to earth.
But back then, the congregation bought a military chapel for $700 and moved it to town. Tooele was part of Bishop Clark's growth plan. Clark saw growth potential in southern Utah and even in suburban Salt Lake, although it would still be decades before this neighborhood would house St. James. The old days of following the railroad and mining towns were over. Garfield's All Souls was one of the disappearing relics of the mining days. A spirited congregation still kept it going into the 50s, despite having less than $16 in the bank. The Kennecott Area Church combined with the LDS Ward to put together a float for the July 4th parade. But Kennecott rained on the parade and within a few years would tear down the company town. However, Bishop Clark would not realize his post-war Utah growth dream. He would become ill after a few short years, and an interim would take over. The Clark years were very short, especially compared to the Moulton years. But a new bishop would carry on the growth plan. Richard Watson came in with a flair. It was a grand parade.
I remember all these young people, and maybe adults as well, lining First South all the way down to St. Mark's Cathedral. And he and other priests and all of the clergy marched down the street, and we all had little banners and flags and cheered.
The former vaudevillian actor turned lawyer turned priest had arrived. He would bring in weekly teas with the bishop, he would build Camp Tuttle, and he would confirm baby boomer after baby boomer until the confirmation pages were worn out of his Book of Common Prayer. And he would see 9 new churches in 10 years. It's the story we will pick up in our next chapter of the 140 years of the Episcopal Church in Utah. I'm Craig Worth.